What up, what up, what up, baby? Your boy Charles. Charles on there's word. Thumbs up button, guys. We're going to go get into Labyrinth by Randall Sullivan. Let's talk about Tupac and his reluctancy to go to that Bruce Seldon fight that night he passed on. Let's check it out, guys. Hit thumbs up button. Subscribe to Charles on his world. Appreciate it.
Tupac seemed to sense that his attendance would put him at risk, and on the morning of the 7th he told Yasmin Fula that instead he would go to Atlanta to deal with some problems among his relatives. During the next several hours, Suge Knight convinced Shakur to change his mind and go to Las Vegas after all.
Hmm.
But Tupac confided to Kidada Jones that he still felt uneasy about the trip. She advised him to wear his bulletproof vest, but Tupac said the weather was too hot for that. Late that afternoon, he boarded a flight to Vegas and said goodbye to Los Angeles for the last time.
I heard he drove. Hold up.
Suge Knight had
I heard that he drove to Las Vegas. I ain't heard he took a flight.
spent much of the past year establishing himself as a presence in Las Vegas. The most visible indication of how Suge hoped to be viewed in City was the house he purchased on Monte Rosa Avenue in the Paradise Valley Township, home to both the toniest estates and most influential citizens in the Las Vegas Valley. Suge's new house was right across the street from Wayne Newton's Shenandoah Ranch, and just 2 doors down from the home of fighter Mike Tyson, who had persuaded Knight to buy the place.
Hmm.
Built of red brick, the house was a sprawling 5,215 feet set on 1.33 acres, with a backyard that bordered a golf course. Suge first had seen it in the Martin Scorsese film Casino, where it served as the home of the organized crime character played by Robert De Niro, Frank Lefty Rosenthal. Suge wore a 7-carat diamond in his ear when he made the deal to buy the place, then proceeded to redecorate in a style not seen previously even in garish Las Vegas, painting the bottom of his swimming pool blood red, then covering the interior of his home with same-color carpet. Much of the furniture was red, too, as was the Rolls-Royce Corniche that Suge drove around town. Even before he purchased his house in Paradise Valley, Suge had endeavored to form associations with those connected to the organized crime families of New York and Chicago. Among the first Las Vegas attorneys he hired was John Spilotro, whose father, Tony the Ant Spilotro, had been headman for the Chicago mob during most of the 1970s, before
Wow.
being brutally beaten, then buried alive in an Indiana cornfield.
That was
Suge would
okay.
step up a class when he retained the services of the notorious Oscar Goodman, an attorney who billed himself as mouthpiece for the mob and
Hmm.
represented most of the important mafiosi charged with crimes in Nevada, as well as Goodman's partner, the former U.S. Attorney David Cheshoff. To open his new nightclub just off the Strip, Suge had relied upon the only 2 Caucasians who were significant figures at Death Row Records. The first, of course, was David Kenner, whose connections to the Genovese family had long fascinated Suge. Perhaps
What?
even more helpful, though, was the accountant Suge had hired as Death Row's new business manager, Steve Cantrock. It was Cantrock who introduced Suge to Robert Amira, the Las Vegas businessman who several years earlier had been indicted along with Joseph Colombo Jr. and Alphonse the Whale Marola in a scheme
Oh.
to defraud the Dunes Hotel with an airline ticket scam. The
Mm.
case against Amira had been dismissed, in inimitable Las Vegas fashion, when the judge claimed he had seen the prosecutor and the jury foreman communicating improperly. With Amira's assistance, Suge was able to take possession of a club that had been known as Botany's back during his days at UNLV, when the patrons were mostly wealthy white people. Botany's previous owner had been convicted a few years earlier for helping the Chicago mob skim money from the Stardust Hotel, however, and the nightclub had languished ever since. Suge
Mm.
reopened the venue as the 662 Club and catered to a predominantly black clientele. The name
Mm.
662 had multiple meanings. On a phone pad, those numbers spelled out MOB for Member of the Bloods. Tupac Shakur liked to say the letters stood for money over bitches. The
Mm.
numbers 662 also appeared in the California Penal Code, however, where they were used to refer to death row inmates.
Mm.
Tupac's first performance after his release from the New York State prison system had been at the 662 Club in November of 1995. The club was packed to nearly twice its capacity that evening, and a crowd that included the entourages of athletes Mike Tyson and Deion Sanders got completely out of hand.
Mm.
The Las Vegas police were not happy about being forced to deal with this many drunk and dangerously violent characters and threatened to close the place down.
Wow.
The scene was only slightly less rowdy when Suge brought Tupac and Snoop Dogg back to Las Vegas with
That
him
was
for
a
the Mike Tyson-Frank Bruno
that
fight
was a
in the
hood
spring of
spot.
1996, and again when Suge and his death row entourage opened the club after Tyson's fight with Peter McNeely that August. Suge did post himself at the door of the club that night and personally tossed several troublemakers out into the parking lot. But the cops were furious anyway about the trouble the 662 Club was causing them and followed through on their promise to close the place. Knight was able to open the club for the evening of the Tyson-Selden fight on September 7th, only by arranging to have his after-party sponsored by Las Vegas PD officer Patrick Barry, a retired professional boxer who was ostensibly using the event to raise money for Barry's boxing gym.
Mm.
A big sign on the club's marquee advertised the event as Barry's Boxing Benefit, while smaller letters identified the organizer as SKP, Suge Knight Productions. A
Mm.
line started forming outside the club at 5:30 that afternoon, hours before the fight's scheduled start, and hundreds of people were trying to buy $75 tickets for the 662 Club's party.
Wow.
Tupac Shakur was staying
That would
with
be
Kidada
100 now.
Jones at the Luxor Hotel in one of the rooms Suge had booked for the weekend. Although his backup singers, the Outlaw Immortals, served as both an entourage and a security detail, Tupac's two main bodyguards were a pair of black ex-police officers, Kevin Hackey and Frank Alexander. Hackey wasn't in Las Vegas, however. Having fallen out with Death Row's head of security, Reggie Wright Jr., over $10,000 he had been paid to work on the set of Tupac's most recent film, Gang Related. That money should have been paid to Rightway Protective Services, insisted Wright, who retaliated by firing the bodyguard.
Mm.
Frank Alexander was alone when he arrived for a meeting with Suge's Las Vegas attorneys, who explained that neither Alexander nor any of Tupac's other security personnel could carry firearms because Death Row had failed to secure the proper clearances from the police.
Mm.
While Alexander fretted about Tupac's vulnerability, the rapper himself was losing big at a blackjack table in the Luxor. The other members of the Death Row contingent noticed right off that Tupac wasn't wearing the medallion of the hooded figure in an electric chair
Mm.
that had been around his neck since Suge presented him with it months earlier. The new figure on Tupac's gold chain was a $30,000 diamond-studded replication of the emblem he had chosen for his own company, Euthanasia, a black angel of death, on its knees, head tilted down, backed by enormous wings and a golden halo. Tupac finally broke his losing streak and
Where
was
you get
ahead of the
that? That
game
was
when he
like a
left the
market.
casino and made his way across a footbridge to the MGM Grand, where the Tyson-Bruno fight would take place. Since his release from prison following a rape conviction, Tyson had become a
$30,000.
heroic figure for many gangbangers who believed him persecuted, and an honorary member of the Death Row family. Suge attended every one of his fights, and so did Tupac. Included with Knight and Shakur in the crowd that evening would be the Reverend Jesse Jackson, basketball stars Charles Barkley and Magic Johnson, as well as the hip-hop acts Run DMC and Too Short. At the entrance to the big room where the MGM Grand staged its fights, Tupac was forced to stop and wait for Suge, who had the tickets. It had become commonplace in recent months for Suge to keep even his biggest stars waiting 2, 3, 4, even 5 hours so that he could make an entrance that established his dominance over them.
Wow.
As he watched other celebrities slip inside and take their seats, Tupac was surrounded by fans who pressed forward, ducking under the arms of security guards to take his photograph or demand an autograph.
Mm.
Finally, he lost his temper. "Fuck this shit," he told Alexander. "Every time we go somewhere, he always has to be fucking late. I didn't want to come to Vegas, no fucking way. We gonna miss the fucking fight."
Mm.
Just as Shakur began to threaten to find his own tickets, Knight showed up. Tupac immediately wiped the angry expression from his face, recalled Alexander, who understood that the rapper still hoped for a more amicable parting with Suge than Dre had managed.
Mm.
Suge and Tupac sat together, but weren't in their seats long. The fight was over in less than 2 minutes, as Tyson came out of his corner throwing punches at a furious rate, and Selden dropped to the canvas for good 109 seconds into the first round.
Jesus, that's Mike
While
Tyson.
many at courtside were disappointed, and a few even shouted that the fight had been fixed, Tupac was thrilled by what he'd witnessed.
Hmm.
He danced around with a wild look in his eyes, pumping his arms and throwing punches at the air as he shouted, 50 blows! 50 blows! I counted them! Tupac led the death row group backstage to mingle with Tyson, but after only a couple of minutes, Suge announced that they had to leave.
Hmm.
A startled Tupac complained that it would be the first time he had not congratulated Mike personally after a fight. But Big Suge grabbed the little rapper's arm and led him toward the exit.
Wow.
As they approached the auditorium's main entrance, Suge threw his arm around Tupac's shoulders, embracing him like the little brother that he often called his biggest star. Just as the two men passed through the doors, however, trailed by Alexander and Suge's entourage of Mob Piru homeboys, a blood named Trayvon Trey Lane approached Tupac and whispered something in his ear.
That didn't happen.
Alexander could see trouble coming, especially after he watched Tupac turn his head to stare at a young black man who stood on the other side of the hallway, like he was anticipating the arrival of someone, as the bodyguard would put it later. The young man who stood alone was Orlando Baby Lane Anderson, a South Side Crip, who, along with 7 or 8 of his homies, had jumped him, Trey said, outside a Foot Locker store in the Lakewood Mall. Anderson and the other Crips had snatched the death row medallion off the chain on his neck as they pummeled him, Trey said. Anxious to impress Suge and the other Bloods with his continuing loyalty, Tupac immediately charged across the hallway toward Anderson, trailed by Knight and his entourage. "You from the South?" Tupac asked, but before Baby Lane could answer, Tupac had thrown a punch at him. The Crip went to the ground immediately, recalled Alexander, who found it difficult to believe the skinny rapper could hit that hard. And Baby Lane offered almost no resistance, Alexander said, as Suge and the other Bloods surrounded him, punching, kicking, and stomping. When Tupac's euthanasia medallion tore loose and fell to the ground, the rapper stooped to pick it up. Alexander, a bodybuilder who once had finished second in the Mr. World Championship, seized the opportunity to pull Tupac away and half drag, half carry him toward the nearest exit. Suge and the others were still on Anderson, kicking him while he was down, recalled Alexander, until the hotel's security force arrived on the scene. Suge shouted, "Let's go," and the others immediately scattered in different directions. Alexander led Tupac outside without waiting around to watch what would happen next, but they were at once spotted by a huge crowd of groupies and hangers-on who chased them back to the Luxor. Kidada, whom Alexander considered a surly, snobbish brat, was waiting in their room at the Luxor, where Tupac regaled her with a description of the beating. She was giggling in excitement, recalled Alexander. The girl seemed to love this stuff, though she never got any closer than hearing about it from her boyfriend. Tupac didn't invite her to the party at the 662 Club either, largely ignoring the young woman as he changed from a tan silk shirt and blue jeans into a black and white basketball tank top and teal-colored sweatpants, then led Alexander back downstairs. As they stepped outside the main entrance to the Luxor, Suge and the rest of the death row entourage were loading into a caravan of vehicles for the drive to the 662 Club. They would go to his house first, announced Suge, who intended to delay their arrival so the group could make a grand entrance. Tupac wanted to drive his Hummer with Alexander in the passenger seat and 2 buddies from the Outlaws in back, but Suge told him that they had private business to discuss and persuaded the rapper to ride with him in the big new BMW sedan he had purchased 1 week earlier. Tupac told Alexander to drive his friend Yafu Fula and another member of the Outlaws to Suge's place in Kidada's Lexus. The group stayed only briefly at Knight's house, where everyone took a look at the new death row emblem painted on the bottom of the pool. The caravan that headed toward the strip about 15 minutes later was composed entirely of luxury vehicles. Mercedes, BMWs, Cadillacs, Lexuses. Suge's homies cranked up the Pioneer sound system in the caddy they drove, so loud that the ground was trembling, recalled Alexander, who followed right behind Suge's black BMW. Knight and Shakur were listening to Tupac's newest album, Machiavelli, at an obliterating volume until a police officer riding a bicycle waved them over and forced Suge to turn the sound down. When the cop let them go, Suge continued toward the strip. Alexander hoped that Suge would turn right on Tropicana so that they could enter the club from the rear, but instead, the BMW blew through a light and turned on Flamingo Road, where Tupac's approach to the club became a public spectacle. Cars filled with groupies whose breasts spilled out of low-cut dresses pulled up alongside to show Tupac their assets and angle for inclusion in his entourage. By the time the caravan approached the Maxim Hotel, dozens of cars filled mostly with young women had joined it, and the unarmed Alexander was becoming increasingly nervous. Scores of people on the street and sidewalk angled for a glimpse of 2Pac when Suge stopped for a red light at Corval Lane, right behind the black Cadillac his homeboy K-Dove drove. A Chrysler sedan immediately pulled up on the BMW's left, filled with four young women who smiled to catch 2Pac's attention. Moments later, a white Cadillac rolled to a stop slightly in front and to the right of the BMW. Four young black men were inside, witnesses said, two in front and two in back. But only one riding in the rear extended a .40 caliber Glock through the open left rear window and used it to spray the BMW's passenger side with between 10 and 15 bullets. According to Frank Alexander, the shooter had been sitting on the right side of the Cadillac and had reached across the passenger on his left to fire the shots. A black person, wearing a skull cap, a beanie cap, was the best description of the killer Alexander could give. At least 100 witnesses watched as 2Pac tried to climb into the back seat of the BMW and was hit 4 times in the process. 2 bullets tore open the Thug Life tattoo on his torso, while 2 others wounded him in the hand and leg. The Cadillac peeled away and made a right turn on Corval, heading away from the strip. Instead of calling 911 on his flip phone, Suge made a U-turn against the oncoming traffic as vehicles scattered to avoid a collision. The rest of the death row caravan did the same, jumping medians as they headed toward the strip. 2 bicycle cops who had heard the shots gave chase and were able to catch the BMW only because 2 of the car's tires had been shot out. The shooting scene itself was abandoned as witnesses scattered and the white Cadillac sped away. When Suge stopped the BMW, the 2 bicycle cops approached with guns drawn, and Suge stepped outside with one side of his head.
Anyway, y'all, that is from the Labyrinth. Man, pretty crazy stuff. I mean, we've heard this story before, man, but I don't know, man. It's been speculation about who actually took Tupac's life. Apparently, they said that it wasn't Orlando Anderson. They said it was somebody else. And I think Tupac's dad did an interview with I think it's Art of Dialogue, Bomb First. I can't think of the name. I can't remember the name of the site, but uh, Billy Garland is Tupac's real dad that's still living, and he did a couple of interviews, and he said he believed that Orlando Anderson didn't kill his son. He think it was somebody else. It might have been the police and stuff like that, but I don't know. Whatever. I just think that such a loss, you know. Anyway, what do y'all think about this? It's called Labyrinth. It's by Randall Sullivan. You can get it on Audible. Uh, this is really good, man. Y'all need to check it out. Maybe I'll get a chance. It's on Audible. And go ahead and give me the thumbs up button and subscribe to my channel. Appreciate it.